like to welcome you all on behalf of Historic Somerville and the Somerville Museum. I want to thank you for joining us today, and I'm excited to introduce Ed Gordon for his lecture on my favorite historic homes in Somerville, the Top 10 Countdown. For nearly 40 years, Ed Gordon has been a consultant within the fields of historic preservation, museum administration, and heritage tourism. He has prepared numerous neighborhood historic building surveys for the Boston Landmarks Commission, as well as National Register nominations for the Fort Point Channel and Dorchester Heights neighborhood. Since 1991, he has served as the president of the New England chapter of the Victorian Society in America, which is based in the Gibson House Museum in Boston. Ed is a contributing author to the Victorian Boston Today 12 Walking Tours of 2004. Since 1977, Ed has led several walking tours for the Boston Center for Adult Education. Ed was named Best Boston Tour Guide by Boston Magazine in its 1997 edition. Since 2002, he has been employed as the site administrator and director of public programs at the Old Schwalm Mill Museum in Arlington, Massachusetts. He has been a consultant to the Somerville Historic Preservation Commission since 2005, writing historic building survey forms and walking tours brochures for the annual architectural and historic tours of Somerville. And once again, I'd like to introduce you to Ed Gordon. Thank you very much.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank my friends at Historic Somerville, Inc. and the Somerville Museum, Evelyn Battinelli, Barbara Mangum, Eileen Schofield, for hosting this lecture program this afternoon at the Somerville Museum. I'm talking about the 10 most fascinating historic properties, at least fascinating to me, in Somerville. And we're going to be starting with 215 Washington Street in Union Square. William P. Walker. And so Walker went about this enlargement, and this has all been confirmed by consultants from Historic New England, who went over and met with the owner and looked at the upper floor and a half and confirmed that this is a very early building up top. The extensive two-story L in the back dates to the mid-19th century, and this stands next to a gas station and a parking lot. On the other side is a new condo. And so, you know, on the surface, it looks like a mid-19th century Italianate house, complete with a front porch with the chamfered posts and the bay windows, the octagonal bays that have brackets and cornices that project out a bit. And so this is a house with a very interesting history, and you know, it's a witness house. People out in Lexington and Concord and Arlington, you know, talk about how there are houses out there that witnessed the ride of Paul Revere and witnessed the British retreat. Well, this house, at least the upper floor and a half, witnessed the British retreat from Lexington and Concord on April 19th. It witnessed the Prince of Wales, Edward VII, passing through Union Square on his way back from a visit to Harvard, going back in to Boston. So it's a building that's seen a lot. And then here is the front of the house with very interesting split granite walls on the side of the entrance up to the double doors. And then the second house that we're talking about, and by the way, this is in chronological order, date-wise, construction-wise. So here is 16 Mount Vernon Street in East Somerville, and this is a remarkable street. It is lined pretty much entirely on the east side by buildings dating to the 1845 to 50 period. So this is at the very beginnings of Somerville as a independent town from Charlestown, Somerville becomes independent in 1842. And this is also coinciding with things like the demise of the Middlesex Canal and the rise of the railroad. And in terms of the canal is built in the 1790s, completed about 1803, and by 1840, it's on its way out. And that means that the investors in the canal, who've also invested in land near the canal, are selling off their land, particularly the James Sullivan family. He was a governor of Massachusetts in the early 19th century, and his sons begin to sell off land as it's clear that the Middlesex Canal is not working as well as originally intended. And so they're selling off a lot of real estate. And so East Somerville is opening up. And you have a man like Harrison H. Hutchins here buying this house in the late 1840s. And his occupation is listed as whitener. And what that means is he worked at the Middlesex Bleachery and Dye Works, which was over, it's the site of where Conway Park is today on Somerville Ave. So here he has managed to get the money together to build this very straightforward temple form Greek Revival residence side hall plan with the two parlors to the left of the stair hall with the kitchenelle in the back. And, the Greek Revival comes into vogue in the Boston area, first in public buildings, as seen in the 1819 St. Paul's Church on Tremont Street opposite the Common, followed in the mid-1820s by the Central Market Building over at Quincy Market. And so there's this trickle down from the high-profile public buildings to something, off out in the countryside on Mount Vernon Street. And so you've got the Doric pilasters at the corners. You've got fluted Tuscan columns. Usually Tuscan columns are smooth, but here there's fluting involved. And then you get a detail of this lovely front porch, and the house is very well cared for. The Hutchins family lived here until as late as the early 1980s. And here you've got the typical Greek Revival way to enframe a doorway with the side lights and the narrow rectangular transom above the front door. And of course, this architecture was helped along by what were called pattern books that were published by certain architects like Asher Benjamin, who presented this how-to kind of experience for builders, how to frame a doorway, how to create a staircase, and that kind of thing. So, and then the other interesting thing about this house is that the first floor is faced with flush boards, not the overlapping clapboards, but this Greek Revival interest in suggesting that a wooden material is really stone. And so you would want to paint the house a stone color, maybe even throw sand into the paint to make it look a bit stony. So this is a very good representative of the Greek Revival style. And here is the Martin Draper map, a little vignette from the map was published in 1852. And it shows you that that Mount Vernon Street is only 2 blocks away from Sullivan Square, where all the action is with the southern terminus of the Middlesex Canal, and then the railroads, the Boston and Lowell, go through there. So, it's no wonder that Somerville developed from east to west, as it were, but close by Sullivan Square. And then you see Mount Benedict before it was cut down, where the old nunnery was, that infamous incident of the burning of the nunnery in 1834, the Middlesex Canal above that, wending its way into Sullivan Square. Okay, here is house number 3. This is 9 Aldersey Street on Prospect Hill between Walnut and Vinyl. And I've chosen this because it's really the last house that gives you an idea of what a house like this was like originally when it had ample grounds. The house still has its original 25,000 square foot lot. And, you know, in recent years, there's been rumblings of wanting to build townhouses along the edges and in the back, and happily that hasn't come to pass. But this was built for one of the 3 great families in the beginning on Prospect Hill around 1850, the Hills, the Monroes, and the Vinyls. And this happens to be the home of John Quincy Adams Vinyl. Now there's a name and a half, right? And his brother, Robert Aldersey Vinyl, also lived nearby at the corner of Walnut and Aldersey, where there is now a modern brick apartment instead of Robert's house. And so what's interesting about this house is that it's showing you this kind of early hybrid of the Greek Revival as seen in the paneled corner boards particularly, and the Italianate. So the Italianate is all about the love of arches. You see the arched attic window up there. And it's also about the Italianate often has a different orientation from the Greek Revival. With the Greek Revival, you often get the narrow side gable facing the street. That's where the main entrance is going to be. Here it's been turned around a bit. The main entrance is in the center of the long side of the main block. The porch has been changed, yes. The dormer has been added, but you still get this kind of image of a bucolic lifestyle up on Prospect Hill. Robert and his brother John were the sons of Robert Sr., who came to Somerville in, I believe, the 1820s, even though the family's business was up in what was then called North Chelsea, now Revere, and they had a hay and grain concern that was quite prosperous, and they got into real estate. And by the 1870s, the Vinyls owned over 100 lots from Highland down to Bow, and between Vinyl and between Vinyl and Walnut. And so they were real estate moguls as well, and they would live in this house until at least the early 1940s. And then I just thought I'd throw this in. This was the father's home down in Union Square, Warren Ave, corner of Bow Street, down where I think there's a Sunoco tire store and a parking lot today. Here's this lovely federal-style house that was the home of the Vinyls. And then now we're moving on to Spring Hill. And I'm showing you George Oliver Brastow first because he is really the man who gets Spring Hill, the neighborhood that we're in now. He gets this off the ground as a suburban residential development. He is, among other things, a Massachusetts state senator. More importantly, he is the first mayor of the city of Somerville when it becomes a municipality in 1872. He is the first realtor in Somerville. And so he builds a Greek Revival mansion, a column portico mansion at the corner of Summer and Central at the southwestern corner. And he has this glorious view looking out towards Cambridge and Boston. He can see over to Harvard University. And he gets this idea that he's going to create a 73-lot development, each lot measuring 50 feet by 100 feet. And he's going to hire none other than Alexander Wadsworth, whose great claim to fame, one of them, is the setting out of Mount Auburn Cemetery in 1831. And it has been said that the early rural garden cemeteries like Mount Auburn are the timing is good because this is at the same time of the beginnings of America's first suburbs. And for a lot of our early suburbs, the street systems take the form of winding paths of the type you might see in a cemetery, the type of road that follows the contours of the land. And you don't see that to a great degree on Spring Hill. It's a modified grid plan. But I just want to interject the idea that somebody really talented and well-known is behind the plan. This is the Nathaniel Bowditch statue at Mount Auburn. And so to me, and this house should be the #1 house of all time for Somerville. This is the great residential historical legacy for this city. And, you know, it's been in such a precarious state. I think it's come to a better place in the last 10 years or so. But this is the famous roundhouse that was built in 1855 for the hardware merchant and locksmith Enoch Robinson. And, you know, what you have here is a very rare circular house that is in part coming out of the writings, the books of Orson S. Fowler, Orson Squire Fowler, who is a very interesting character. He was, I think, primarily a phrenologist, and I think most of us have forgotten all about phrenology. This belief that by feeling the lumps on the heads of human beings, you can tell something about their character, their personality, and it was a kind of a pseudoscience whose heyday was like 1820 to 1860. So Fowler, you know, went on an international speaking tour on phrenology, but he was also an architect, and more than an amateur one, who produced books about how the octagonal house and the subset of that, the round house, was ideal because it promoted better ventilation. It promoted more square footage, like 20 feet more you can get out of the interior of a building per floor. And so here you have this very curious design that has segmental headed lintels with prominent keystones, the brackets up above the second floor windows. The bracket is synonymous with the Italianate style, which is also at work in this building. It is 40 feet in diameter. It has this crenellated aspect above the second floor cornice, and it originally had that on the very top as well. I don't know what happened to that top floor, that kind of castle-like detail that's still above the second floor. But this is what, you know, this is what a lot of people think of when they hear the name Orson Fowler, the idea of the octagonal house. And this tended to be for very wealthy people. P.T. Barnum in Bridgeport, Connecticut, famously had an octagonal house in the form of the Taj Mahal, only the octagonal version. And so, and then apologize for this less than clear image, but this is a postcard, recent postcard that I think I bought in a Union Square card shop that very proudly shows this. Most important residential landmark in the city. By the 1980s, the building was in very poor condition. In 1986, the North Bennett Street School went in and did some repair work, and then finally in 2007, a new owner came in and seems to have done some stabilization. And I'm not real current on what the current situation here is, but what? It's at 36 Atherton Street. So it's the lower slopes of Spring Hill, just up from Somerville Ave, and just west of Central Street. The Italianate style comes to the fore around 1850, and it has some longevity. It lasts into the 1880s in some places, and it is coming out of Italy. This is the extreme American folk art version of, Renaissance-era Italianate buildings by way of Great Britain, who got into the Italianate in the 18-teens and 20s, particularly for gentlemen's clubs. And so here in 1867, you have or 68, the Elisha Hopkins house at the corner, it's 237 School Street, corner of Oakland Street. And Hopkins lists his profession in the directories is listed as Master Mariner. So I take that to mean a retired sea captain, as some of these folks were. And so this is the type of Italianate house that Somerville does well, that is a real thing here in Somerville. The cross gable house or the center gable house that has this, the main facade has this center attic gable with oculus windows at the ends and in the center that are very much a part of the Italianate vocabulary. And also what's at work here is the front porch, which is a later addition. It's a Queen Anne porch addition. And a lot of people, they want to be purists, and why can't this look like the Italianate porch? But I think it's good and healthy to have buildings that reflect a progression over time, and to see a very well-crafted later addition like this Queen Anne porch with the turned posts and the brackets. And then this little gable marking the main entrance to the porch. Very handsome building that was very, very weathered up until recent times. Paint peeling off. Now whoever owns it now has painted it up beautifully. And it's a real gift to the streetscape. All right, now you're going to think I'm out of my mind to think this is great. But I do. I think it's very quirky. We're looking at 76 Cross Street, which rises above a 1922 commercial block, numbered 72 to 78 Cross Street. And so what's happening here is that in 1861, the Sullivan family of Middlesex Canal fame, they've gotten over to Cross Street now in their real estate sales, and they sell off a parcel. And then a real estate broker from New York City buys the property and then sells the property in turn to the Hortons, a father and two sons who are trunk makers, as in like suitcases, only I'm taking this to mean bigger trunks, who buy the parcel and hire none other than Alexander Wadsworth to survey and divide up the three lots here on the corner. And then three Italianate houses get built, and the one on Cross Street gets hoisted up in 1922 rather than move it or tear it down. And I just think it's not consciously being preservationist, but it is something that somebody deemed worthy of keeping. So the three houses date to about 1870. Now, we're getting over to 70 Pearl Street in East Somerville, and we're looking at a sea captain's house. This is Captain Edmund Burke. Some of you who have been on the walking tours know this story that in 1863, Captain Burke, who was a sea captain in the citrus trade between Boston and the Azore Islands, they're 800 miles west of Portugal, owned by Portugal still. The Azores, for a time in the mid-19th century, had a very profitable trade with oranges and lemons. And Burke was part of this trade. And when he was coming back from the Azores on his way back to Boston, he came upon a ship that was in distress, a passenger ship called, ironically enough, the Gratitude. And so he said, yes, the folks on the Gratitude can board his ship, the Azore, but they will have to dump over the very valuable cargo of citrus fruits, which he did. And the crew and passengers of the Gratitude made their way back safely to Boston Harbor, and Burke was treated as a hero. This is in 1863. And then in 1870, he builds this house at the corner of Pearl and I think Franklin Street. And this just brings up the point that Pearl Street in its day, from about 1865 to 1900, was a premier street in Somerville, town-wide. That this is where the big trophy houses got built. And so here we have a great example of an Italianate mansard style house. There are 3 or 4 of these big houses still on the street. You see brackets everywhere, at the front door, at the door hood, at the eaves of the octagonal bays, up at the roof cornice. And the bracket, again, this is the great age of, you've got steam power now. You can easily make these building materials with a steam-powered saw, with a jigsaw. And you can have these elements, you can order them out of a catalog, and you can have them shipped to your building site. And so you've got the mansard roof, the double-pitched roof, that makes its first appearance in the Boston area and really America in general in 1847 at the Deacon House in the south end of Boston, Washington, corner of West Concord Street. No longer there, long gone. But this was a very French-style house, Boston adopts this roof type for a lot of the houses built in the Back Bay between Arlington and Dartmouth Street in the beginning of the Back Bay development, and then it makes an appearance in Somerville, and then a detail of the brackets and the what's called a dental course between the brackets of the octagonal cornice, baize cornice. It's just a very lively kind of historic style, and I show 47 Franklin Street because this was the home of the man who was most probably responsible for building these big mansard houses. This is the Alonzo Bower House of the late 1860s, and he was a housewright, and there seems to be evidence from deeds that he was the builder of several of these big mansard roofed houses. Okay, now we are, I think, coming on to a little-known house on Prospect Hill, the East Slope, up above the McGrath and O'Brien Highway, off of Boston Street. This is 5 Prospect Hill Avenue, And when I think about this house, when I look at it, I think, why aren't there more brick houses in Somerville? If this was such a big brick-making center from 1830 to about 1885, why aren't there more examples of brick houses? And most of the bricks that were made in Somerville, I think this is fair to say, were intended for the enormous building booms that occurred across the Charles River in Boston. When you think about building up the South End, building up the Back Bay, using Somerville brick. And here in the early to mid 1880s, you have the Alford and Richard Hynes house. And they were, their trade is listed as masons. They were bricklayers. They were not, owning the great brickyards like Jake's or Jacques or Wyatt or Sanborn or something like that. They're going around and they're building brick houses, and they so when they go to build their own home, they're really pulling out all the stops in terms of quirky detail. There is a string course that wraps around the building between the first and second floor that's made out of this kind of terracotta, a highly fired type of brick that's been painted white. There are stones inset into the walls. Here's this very quirky circular window to the right of the main entrance with these wonderful panels with raised, the raised circles are called bosses. You've got these turned, more traditional Queen Anne porch posts. And then here, if you look down below, you can see these really odd X shapes that are incised in these stone blocks. It's just got a wealth of detail that you won't see really anywhere else in Somerville. Somerville has so many great examples of the Queen Anne style. This is one of the things that Somerville does very well. And it's no accident that Porch Fest started in Somerville, because Queen Anne gives you these wonderful porches to sit out on. And, let me just say that the Queen Anne represents a kind of relaxation of the way Americans conduct their lives. Prior to this, particularly in the Italianate mansard houses, you've got these rigid rectangular forms, and life is conducted inside entirely. Now people are feeling comfortable. They're going to sit out in the evening on their encircling verandas. They're going to sit in porch swings. They're going to have afternoon tea. They're not as private, I think, as they were in earlier decades. And so the Queen Anne comes into vogue in the Boston area in the late 1870s and has its big decade in the 1880s, early 90s, still hanging in there as late as 1910. But it's a style that in some ways has very little to do with Queen Anne of England in the first decade of the 18th century. The Queen Anne, at least in brick, refers to a period in English architectural history, 1690 to 1710, the reigns of William and Mary. William is a Dutch prince. He's bringing in things like the stepped gable for housing and kind of picturesque Dutch effects. And then in the early 1710s, early 1700s, you have the beginnings of the Georgian, of classical-based architecture. So there's an architect in England in the 1860s, Richard Norman Shaw, who was building Queen Anne revival houses out in the English countryside, and he's doing this in brick. But there's also a wooden version of the Queen Anne that gets built in America. For the brick Queen Anne, you go to the Back Bay. You go to places like Fairfield Street in the Back Bay to see brick Queen Anne houses. But the wooden houses have you hear the word whimsical associated with this style, and that term really bothers me. But yes, there is a lot that is whimsical about this. The projections of the tower, the porches, the oriels, the bays. There's a kind of an angled oriel up in the attic there on the left, beneath a half-timbered kind of triangular segment of the attic gable. It's a grab bag of architectural references. The Queen Anne loves to mix and match. It mixes clapboards with shingles and different types of shingles. You can have square shingles, scallop shingles on the same building. It's about variety of window sizes and shapes. So this is 45 Walnut Street, corner of Boston Street. Actually, one side of it borders Monroe Street. And what's interesting about this is this was a bigger, fancier trophy house when it was built in 1890, built on the footprint of a torn-down mansard mansion. The Bradshaw family had a mansion on this corner, and it was taken down to make way for this house. And what remains of the Bradshaw mansion are the granite steps and some of the granite curbing, some of the granite posts. They kept that. But this was the Louisville Niles house. And Louisville Niles was a very prosperous grocer who, together with some family members, had a grocery store in Boston. He was one of the commuters. And I neglected to mention earlier that the railroad was everything in terms of Somerville's development, with the Boston and Lowell Railroad coming in 1835, the Fitchburg coming in as freight rail in the late 1830s, passenger rail in 1842, so that, these captains of industry, these front office guys can live in Somerville and commute to work via the railroad. And really, the railroad is the game changer, I believe, that allows Somerville to become independent of Charlestown, that it's no longer the land beyond the neck, the farming and all of that, but there's industry getting built along the railroads, and Somerville starting to get its own identity. But at this point, we're in 1890. This is Lange Terrace, which was built in the late 1880s, right around 1890. It was a Samuel Lange real estate project, and it is numbers 359, 61, 63, and 65. It's a row that is beautifully unified, particularly up at the roof line with the stepped gables. This is so purely brick Queen Anne. This is so sophisticated. It would look great in any, American city neighborhood near the city center. This is just the height of sophistication for Somerville around 1890. And it has wonderful stained glass transom windows. It has excellent terracotta brickwork detail. And terracotta, by the way, is a type of highly fired brick, typically fired in a kiln, brought to the building site, installed on the face of the building. So this is on Winter Hill. This is on Broadway. And just want to make sure you know that. And who lived in one of these buildings? None other than Barack Obama. When he was a law student at Harvard University, he lived for 3 years at Lange Terrace. And on a tour once, I had a tour attendee say to me that her mother, cleaned apartments in this block back when he was there, and that he was the only one that tipped her at Christmas time, that he was the only one that thought to remember her for her work, which I thought was a really beautiful telling story. And then here we have stained glass window, and who were the original owners of these buildings. I have to say, a retiree, a widow, and the treasurer of the Boston and Maine Railroad. And then, here you can see some of this wonderful brickwork, and they've left the lintel over the entrance in its rock-faced rough state for added texture. And I show this in East Somerville because this was an earlier Samuel Lange made project. This is at the corner of Cross and Broadway. And on the right, the housing facing Cross Street, that's the way both rows originally looked when they were built around 1880 to 85. This is kind of like, in an odd way, a kind of a dress rehearsal for long-made Terrace. But in the early 1920s, the Broadway part of the groups was hoisted up onto a commercial first floor. So Lange starts in this very typical kind of Italianate row house kind of way, only 5 to 10 years earlier before Lange. Okay, getting a little bit into the colonial revival. This is 28 Highland Avenue, corner of Walnut Street. As it turns out, Highland Avenue will become one of the premier thoroughfares for seeing great houses in the city of Somerville. And this is the Alfonso Holland Carville house of 1890 to 1891. And Carville was a doctor, a very important doctor for the city of Somerville. He is one of the founders, if not the key founder, of Somerville Hospital. And he's also a key figure on the school committee here in Boston because his children attend the public schools. And what we're looking at here is this very interesting mix of a progressive colonial revival main body of the house, the main block with the bowed fronts that say Federal Revival. Think, the bowed fronts of Bullfinch on Beacon Hill, only in the wooden version. You've got, hard to see from this slide, I know, but a very graceful Federal Revival fan light over the front door, the side lights. But then what's sort of a little bit regressive is the roof. There's a mansard up there in 1890. The mansard pretty much goes out of style by around 1880. So it's like 3 steps forward and 2 steps back or something. But that's what's lovable about this house, I think. One of the things that Somerville does better than any other city or town I can think of is the big wooden apartment block from the 1890s. This is the Drouet or the Drouet block of 1898 by the architect Aaron Gould, who was born up in Nova Scotia, makes his way down the coast, first to Maine, then to the southern states where he works on hotels. Then he comes up and he does a lot of work in Somerville, including the Martin Carr School over on Spring Hill. And so, this is, to me, this says welcome to Union Square. This is the gateway, the western gateway to Union Square. And it's one of 3 great buildings like this. There is the Richmond Apartments over at Wesley and Bow Street, and then there's one diagonally across the street at Carlton and Somerville Ave. And it's just the fact that there is so much detail, so many units, just an extraordinary architectural statement here. And with the 3-decker, I'm always looking for exceptions to the rule. To the rule. Here's a really interesting exception, 20 Wheeler Street, corner of Pinckney Street, East Somerville. So rather than having the straightforward, rectangular, boxy 3-decker, you've got an L-shaped 3-decker that's got the porches nestled at the intersection of 2 of the principal components. It's a building of 1899. And it's originally housing folks who, they're renters, they work for the Boston and Maine Railroad. So sometimes there's a variation on the three-decker, which comes to the fore almost simultaneously in Boston and Worcester. And these cities both claim getting the three-decker first, but you see the three-decker, in neighborhoods like South Boston and Dorchester. And it's, street after street in those Boston neighborhoods are full of three-deckers. And what developers found was that this was a fast, efficient, this was a reasonably priced way to create housing for the immigrant workers who are coming in with jobs in factories or maybe clerical work downtown. And they need to be housed, and they need to be given something that's going to be healthful, that's going to have porches front and back, that's going to have inside nice features like built-in china cabinets and colonial revival mantelpieces and that kind of thing. So the three-decker really takes off around 1890 when the electric trolley system fans out into Boston area neighborhoods and Somerville, and kind of starts to lag in around 1915 and then fades away towards the beginning of the Great Depression in 1930. The two-family is something that Somerville does wonderfully well, and you see it to good extent on Broadway in West Somerville, Powder House Circle, opposite Nathan Tufts Park. And really this whole development of this area, College Ave over to Pearson Road, Broadway up to the Tufts campus. This is made possible by a donation of the Nathan Tufts family to the city of Somerville in 1892 when they give the land that will become Powder House Park. They will take down the Powder House Pickle Factory that was on, the future park. Their own homestead will fall by the wayside that stood where 771 and 773 Broadway is today. And so, I really should have chosen one of these two families facing Powder House Park, but I'll tell you why I didn't in a moment. But of course, the Powder House, the 1703 or 1704 structure, that it was originally a windmill and becomes a place for the British Crown's storage of gunpowder in 1747, and then that rather interesting foray on the part of British troops in 1774 to confiscate the gunpowder from this structure. Very storied historical park that will have a lot of cachet for developers and realtors and people who want to buy into this area. And this is also concurrent with the creation of Powder House Boulevard in 1900 that creates a link with the Fells Way, with the Middlesex Fells Parkway. So, but the two family that I chose, and this will be my last style, is 46 Bromfield Road, which has a sentimental connection for me. My grandfather and grandmother and my grandfather's mother lived here from 1912 to 1916. The house was built about 1909. And my grandparents married in 1911. And for a time, they lived in Brooklyn, where my grandmother was from. And then he wanted to move up here to be close to his mother, and so they lived with her for until 1916. And then reading between the lines, these were both strong-willed ladies, and maybe it was tough to be under the same roof. So my grandfather and grandmother go back to Brooklyn and live near her family, and that's where my father and I will grow up. But they live here for a short period. My father was a printer. He was a pressman who commuted to work in Boston, and when they moved to New York, he goes to work as a printer for the New York Times newspaper, and by the 1940s he becomes the president of the New York Times Printers Union. So I just wanted to bring in a house with a personal connection. Bromfield Road is a great place to see two families, to see this alternation of gable roofs and gambrel roofs, and references to the colonial revival, and the modified Palladian window to the left of the doorway, and the solid front porch with the wood shingles. Bromfield Road is a good place to look at two families, as is West Somerville in general. And I'll just close with this thought. In 1915, a group of West Somervillians go to Somerville City Hall. They approach the alderman, and they wanted to pass a rule saying that three-deckers cannot be built in West Somerville. They tried to stop that, and they said because it attracts a group of people who will not be committed to community civic life, and that they are renters and we are homeowners. So I just thought that was really, really interesting. That, and of course, that didn't happen. There was no rule that, if you go beyond Teal Square, you will see any number of three-deckers. But I thought, I found that in the Somerville Journal in a 1915 newspaper. Okay, so on that note, I will close, and I thank you all very much.